Why do some of our subscribers love my intros? Because they can trust I will usually have a dad joke. Okay, so today I'm explaining the differences between a trust fund versus a will. But really quickly, shout out to our very loyal subscriber, Bree, for that intro joke idea. Hopefully everyone got it. It's a play on the word trust. Anyway, so a trust fund and a will can be a little bit confusing because they both really do the same thing, okay? They essentially transfer property to the heirs or the beneficiaries of their choosing. But there are some key differences that you need to know about. So in this brief episode, I'm gonna do my best to explain very clearly trust funds versus wills. So if that sounds good to you, please like this video while the intro plays. Hey there and welcome to our channel. I'm Sean with Life Accounting, the accounting company that helps you save on taxes and build more wealth. Let's go ahead and get into it. So let's start with number one. What is a will? So simply put, a will is a written document expressing a deceased person's wishes. So what are some examples of wishes that someone could want if they were to pass away? Well, of course, you would want to dictate the distribution of your assets to your loved ones, whether it's a spouse, a child, a long-term friend, or even a nonprofit organization. You may also want to arrange in your will exactly how your funeral or your memorial will be held, down to the specific location and songs that are played at your funeral, right? You may also want to determine, okay, who is the guardian of your kids if you have full custody? And that is especially important if you have a spouse who is no longer capable or able to care for your children. So basically, a will gives you a lot of decision power over what happens to your estate or your property and assets after you die. But there are some real drawbacks of wills, which I'll talk about in just a second. But first, let me define number two, what is a trust fund? So a trust fund is basically when you trust someone else, which is called the trustee, to handle your estate transfer or the distribution of your assets to your beneficiaries or to your heirs. Now, the trust that I like and many people recommend is called the revocable living trust. And it's called a living trust because it's executed while the trustor is still alive. And it's revocable because it may be changed at any time for whatever reason while the trustor is still alive. Now, trusts tend to be a little bit more expensive than wills to both create and maintain, but there still are a lot more differences where that comes from, which I'll definitely get into in just a second. But first, let's look at what do wills and trust funds have in common? Well, as I mentioned earlier, they are both really great planning tools that help ensure your assets are protected and given to the people or organizations that you want to have your assets given to after you pass away. So they both essentially do the same thing. Now, the second thing they have in common is that they both can be revised. So at any time, if you change your mind about who you want to give your assets to, then you can amend your trust fund or will anytime you like to. And it's really that simple, okay? A trust fund and a will help make passing off your assets to your family and your loved ones a lot easier so that when you're gone, there is a clear path as to what happens next, and there is likely no bickering or fighting amongst your family. All right, now that we have a grasp on the similarities, let's go ahead and talk about number four, the main part of this video, the differences between a trust versus a will. So for starters, a will only becomes active after a will holder dies, whereas a trust fund is active the day you create and execute it. So a trustor can start distributing the assets before their death. Okay, so that's one big difference. Another big difference is when it comes to guardianship of minor children. So inside a will, you can appoint who is the guardian of your children. So for example, in an event where you pass away and there is no spouse, You can basically state who gets guardianship or custody of your children, okay? This is something that you cannot do. I repeat, you cannot do with a trust fund. Now, the third big difference is when it comes to court and legal battles. So in general, trusts are not usually disputed or challenged in court, and they do not have to go to a probate court, whereas wills must go through a probate court. Okay, let me repeat that. Wills must go through a probate court, where the will is then evaluated and can be challenged by other parties. Which brings me to the fourth big difference: privacy. Because since wills must go through a probate court, it means that the estate is made public record. So everyone can essentially see what assets were distributed and to who. And because a trust fund typically does not go through court, it can remain private. So if privacy is a big deal to you and you don't want everyone to see what assets you have and who they're going to, then a trust fund is likely more appealing to you. The fifth big difference is on rules around inheritance. So with a trust fund, you can be very, very specific about the requirements for which your estate or your assets are transferred. Okay, so for example, you can set your assets to only be distributed to your beneficiaries at a certain age, at a certain education level, at a certain net worth, anything that you'd like it to be, okay? It's up to you. You can make the requirements whatever you want them to be, okay? Whereas with a will, you don't get to set any rules, okay? So basically, when you pass away, that's it. Your assets are distributed to the people that you want them to be distributed to. Now, let me move on to my fifth point of this video, which is what happens if you die without a will or a trust? Like, what happens to your bank accounts? What happens to your real estate property? What happens to the cars that you drive and you own? Heck, what even happens to your devices, your laptops, your phones? And of course, what happens to your children? Well, if you find yourself without a legal document or a trustee that you appointed, then you're leaving it into the state laws to determine what happens to your assets. And in some cases, this can lead to extremely long court battles and financial hardship on the people that you love. So, of course, if you can, try to avoid any confusion and set your family up with a trust or a will so that they can celebrate your legacy instead of fighting over your assets. Now, coming up next, I have a video on how to set up a trust fund step by step. So if you haven't checked that out already, make sure you do, and I'll see you over there.